Most people know France as a land of fashion, fine cuisine, and romance. But few realize the bloody and dramatic path this nation has traveled to become what it is today. From brutal Gallic warriors to brilliant kings, from the terror of the Revolution to the grandeur of the Napoleonic Empire, French history is full of incredible twists and turns that have changed not only France itself, but the entire world. Modern France occupies an area of 643,801 square kilometers, about 248,500 square miles, in Western Europe. The country is bordered by the Atlantic Ocean to the west and the Mediterranean Sea to the south. The population is approximately 68 million. France borders 8 countries and is one of the world's leading economic powers. Today, it is a republic with a strong presidential system, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, a nuclear power, and a founding member of the European Union. But behind this modern grandeur lies a remarkable history that began over 2,000 years ago in the dense forests of ancient Gaul. Here's an incredible fact. The territory of modern-day France witnessed one of the most dramatic clashes of the ancient world. A war that lasted 8 years and culminated in the complete subjugation of the proud Gallic tribes by the Roman legions. But this conflict was only the first chapter in a long history of struggle, triumph, and tragedy. This is the story of France. Be sure to subscribe to the channel to learn more amazing stories about the world's great powers. The territory of modern-day France was inhabited in ancient times by numerous Celtic tribes, collectively called Gauls by the Romans. These peoples were by no means a single nation. Historians and archaeologists count around 60 to 100 main Gallic tribes, each with its own traditions, dialects, and territories. The Gauls lived in fortified settlements called oppida and engaged in agriculture, livestock breeding, and crafts. They were skilled metalworkers. Gallic swords and armor were renowned throughout Europe, but most of all, the Gallic tribes loved to fight among themselves. Constant internecine strife weakened them in the face of an external threat, which was already gathering from the south. The Gauls had no idea that their disunity would become the main reason for their eventual enslavement. In 58 BC, the Roman proconsul Gaius Julius Caesar was appointed to Gaul. The formal pretext for his intervention was the migration of the Helvetii, a Celtic tribe who had decided to leave the territory of modern-day Switzerland and resettle in Western Gaul. Caesar took advantage of this situation to begin a systematic conquest of all Gallic lands. The Gallic War began, lasting 8 years and forever changing the fate of the region. Initially, many Gallic tribes underestimated the Roman threat and continued to fight among themselves. Some leaders even formed alliances with the Romans against their fellow tribesmen. This short-sightedness cost them dearly. The Gauls desperately resisted the Roman invasion. The Nervi tribes nearly routed Caesar's legions in 57 BC. The maritime Veneti controlled the Atlantic coast and resisted the Roman navy for a long time. But the decisive moment of the war came with the rebellion led by the young Arverni chieftain Vercingetorix in 52 BC. This charismatic leader achieved what no one before him had managed, uniting the disparate Gallic tribes against a common enemy. Vercingetorix employed scorched earth tactics, avoided major battles, and dealt the Romans painful blows. For a time, it seemed the Gauls might defeat the greatest military machine of the ancient world, but the experience and discipline of the Roman legionaries ultimately prevailed. In 52 BC, the Romans besieged the fortress of Alesia, where Vercingetorix had taken refuge with the remnants of his army. Caesar employed a double siege. His engineers constructed a double line of fortifications, blocking both the fortress itself and the approaches to it. When the Gallic relief army failed to reach the besieged, the defenders' situation became hopeless. Vercingetorix made a courageous decision. He surrendered to the Romans to save the lives of his soldiers. The Gallic leader was taken to Rome, where he spent 6 years in prison and was then executed during Caesar's triumphal procession. The fall of Alesia marked the end of independent Gaul. The freedom-loving tribes became submissive subjects of the Roman Empire. The Roman conquest brought not only destruction, but also the achievements of classical civilization to the Gallic lands. The Romans built an excellent road network, connecting all parts of the province. New cities arose: Lutetia, which later became Paris; Lugdunum, which evolved into Lyon; and Massilia, now known as Marseille. Amphitheaters, theaters, baths, and aqueducts were built. The Gallo-Roman population gradually adopted Roman customs, laws, and the Latin language. However, Gallic traditions did not disappear completely. They blended with Roman ones, creating a unique Gallo-Roman culture. Gaul became one of the richest provinces of the Roman Empire, supplying the metropolis with grain, wine, metals, and slaves. It seemed that Roman rule would last forever. Christianity began to penetrate Gaul in the 2nd century A.D. The first Christian communities arose in major cities. Lyon, where a brutal persecution of Christians occurred in 177 A.D., Arles and Narbonne. Saint Genevieve became the patron saint of Lutetia, and Saint Martin of Tours became one of the most venerated saints in Gaul. By the 4th century, Christianity had received official recognition and began to actively spread among the Gallo-Roman population. Christian bishops gradually became influential figures in the cities, and monasteries became centers of education and culture. The new religion paved the way for future changes in the very foundations of society. However, the Roman Empire's power gradually weakened. Barbarian invasions began in the 3rd century as Germanic tribes increasingly crossed the empire's borders in search of new lands. The Alemanni penetrated the Rhine, the Visigoths advanced from the east, and the Vandals plundered the southern regions. The Roman legions struggled to contain the barbarian onslaught. In the 4th century, the situation was further complicated by the emergence of the Huns under Attila, who drove the Germanic tribes westward. Gaul became an arena for constant warfare between the Romans, Germans, and Huns. The great empire was crumbling at the seams. No one could have imagined then that the small Germanic tribe of the Salian Franks would become the founder of one of the greatest European powers. In the mid-5th century, the Franks, led by King Childeric, began actively expanding their holdings in northern Gaul. But the true founder of the Frankish state was Childeric's son, Clovis I, who ascended the throne in 481. This young leader proved to be an outstanding military leader and politician. During his quarter-century reign, Clovis conquered most of Gaul, defeating the Alemanni, Burgundians, and Visigoths. But his greatest achievement was not a military one, but a religious one. In 496, Clovis converted to Christianity and was baptized in Reims by Archbishop Remigius. This move secured him the support of the Gallo-Roman population and the Catholic clergy. Clovis's baptism marked a turning point in European history. The Frankish kingdom became the first German state to accept Catholic Christianity. This decision determined the religious identity of future France for many centuries to come. Clovis founded the Merovingian dynasty, which ruled the Franks for over 2 centuries. After the king's death in 511, his dominions were divided among his 4 sons, according to Frankish custom. An era of internecine wars began, weakening royal authority. Gradually, real power shifted to the mayors of the palace, the administrators of the royal court, who ruled in the name of the increasingly weakened, lazy kings. The most famous of the mayors of the palace was Charles Martel, who in 732 defeated the Arabs at the Battle of Poitiers and halted Islamic expansion in Europe. This victory saved Christian Europe from Muslim conquest and earned Charles the glory of being the savior of Christianity. Charles Martel's son, Pepin the Short, with the blessing of the Pope in 751, deposed the last Merovingian king and founded the new Carolingian dynasty. Pepin was crowned King of the Franks, receiving divine sanction for his rule. His son, Charles, surpassed the glory of all his predecessors, becoming known as Charlemagne. During his 46-year reign, this remarkable ruler created an empire that encompassed the territories of modern-day France, Germany, northern Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, Switzerland, and part of Spain. Charlemagne conquered Saxony, subdued the Lombards in Italy, and halted the Moorish advance in Spain. But the crowning glory of his reign was his imperial coronation in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome in the year 800. Pope Leo III placed the imperial crown on Charlemagne's head, proclaiming the restoration of the Western Roman Empire. Charlemagne's empire was an attempt to unite Christian Europe under a single authority. Charlemagne patronized the arts and sciences, and the finest scholars in Europe gathered at his court in Aachen. This began what historians call the Carolingian Renaissance, a period of cultural upsurge in the early Middle Ages. However, even such a mighty empire proved to be built on shaky foundations. After Charlemagne's death in 814, a bitter power struggle erupted among his heirs. The empire was torn apart by civil wars until the Treaty of Verdun in 843 divided it into three parts. Western Francia went to Charles the Bold and became the core of what would become France. Eastern Francia went to Louis the German and formed the basis of Germany. And the central part, with the imperial crown, went to Lothair. This division determined the political map of Western Europe for centuries to come. The great dream of a unified Christian empire was shattered by dynastic ambitions and regional interests. The 9th and 10th centuries were a time of severe trials for Western France. Vikings began systematically raiding French lands, moving up the Seine, Loire, and Rhone rivers into the interior. These brutal warriors from Scandinavia plundered cities, destroyed monasteries, and carried off thousands into slavery. In 885 and 886, the Vikings besieged Paris, but the city heroically resisted under the leadership of Count Eudes. Simultaneously, a threat came from the north from the Hungarians, a nomadic people who ravaged the eastern regions of the country. Central royal authority weakened so much that it could no longer protect its subjects. Under these circumstances, local feudal lords became increasingly independent, creating their own armed forces and fortifications. The last Carolingian king, Louis the Lazy, died in 987 without direct male heirs. An assembly of feudal lords elected Hugues Capet, Count of Paris, a descendant of the noble Robertin family, as the new king. Thus began the reign of the Capetian dynasty, which in various branches would rule France until the French Revolution. The election of Hugues Capet marked an important principle. The French throne was not necessarily hereditary, but could be chosen by the nobility. However, the early Capetians were weak rulers, controlling only a small territory around Paris and Orleans, the so-called royal domain. The rest of France was divided among powerful feudal lords, the Dukes of Normandy, Aquitaine, and Burgundy, and the Counts of Flanders, Toulouse, Anjou, and Blois. The king was considered merely first among equals and was often inferior in power to his vassals. Feudal fragmentation reached its peak. Each castle became an independent center of power. The roads were infested with bandits, trade stalled, and the cities fell into decline. The Catholic Church attempted to soften morals by proclaiming the peace of God, a ban on war on certain days of the week and on religious holidays. But the feudal lords paid little attention to church regulations. France became a patchwork of warring principalities. The Capetians' relationship with the Dukes of Normandy was particularly complex. These descendants of the Viking chieftain Rollo, who received lands at the mouth of the Seine from King Charles the Simple in 911, created one of the most powerful feudal states in Europe. In 1066, the Duke of Normandy, William the Conqueror, conquered England at the Battle of Hastings and became King of England. Now the French kings were dealing with a vassal who was also the sovereign ruler of a neighboring kingdom. This paradoxical situation, the English king as vassal of the French king, would become the source of centuries-long conflicts between the two monarchies. The situation became even more complicated under King Louis VII. In 1137, he married Eleanor of Aquitaine, heiress to vast estates in southwestern France. Eleanor was one of the richest and most influential women of her time, but her marriage to the pious and ascetic Louis proved unsuccessful. The couple had different personalities and interests. In 1152, they divorced under the pretext of kinship. Just 2 months after the divorce, Eleanor married Henry Plantagenet, Count of Anjou, who became Henry II of England in 1154. This marriage brought Eleanor's estates to the English crown, and the English kings now controlled more French territory than the French kings themselves. The Angevin Empire of the Plantagenets stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees. Henry II and his heirs controlled Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, Poitou, and Aquitaine. They were vassals of the French king in their continental possessions, but sovereign rulers in England. This complex situation created constant tension and conflict. The French kings could not accept the fact that most of their nominal kingdom was under the control of the English crown. A long struggle to return these lands to direct royal control began. The turning point came under the grandson of Louis VII, King Philip II Augustus. This outstanding ruler radically shifted the balance of power in favor of the French crown. Philip Augustus proved a skilled politician and diplomat, skillfully exploiting the contradictions within his enemies. He managed to pit the sons of Henry II against each other, supporting their rebellions against their father. After the death of Henry II in 1189, direct conflict began between Philip Augustus and the new English king, Richard the Lionheart. The Third Crusade temporarily distracted the opponents, but after Richard's return, the wars resumed with renewed vigor. The true triumph of French arms came under Richard's successor, King John Lackland. In 1204, Philip Augustus began the systematic conquest of English possessions in France. Within a few years, he had recaptured Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and most of Poitou. John attempted to form a coalition against France, allying with the German Emperor Otto IV and the Count of Flanders. The decisive battle took place on July 27, 1214, near the village of Bouvines in Flanders. The French army, under the king's personal command, utterly routed the coalition. The victory at Bouvines was a triumph of French arms and made France the leading power in Europe. Philip Augustus quadrupled the royal domain and laid the foundations of French absolutism. Philip Augustus's grandson, King Louis IX, went down in history as Saint Louis. His reign, from 1226 to 1270, marked the golden age of the French Middle Ages. Louis IX was renowned for his piety, justice, and wise governance. He introduced important judicial reforms, banning private wars between feudal lords and establishing royal justice. Under his reign, the famous Notre Dame Cathedral, a masterpiece of Gothic architecture, was built. The University of Paris, founded by Louis, became one of the leading centers of learning in Europe. The king twice participated in the Crusades to the Holy Land and Tunisia, where he died of the plague. Louis IX was canonized by the Catholic Church and became the only French king saint. The last Capetians continued their policy of strengthening royal power. Philip III the Bold added the county of Toulouse to the domain, completing the subjugation of Languedoc. His son, Philip IV the Fair, waged a decisive struggle against opponents of centralization. He routed the Flemish city militias at Mons-en-Pévèle in 1304. Even more dramatic was the struggle with Pope Boniface VIII, who claimed supremacy over secular rulers. Philip the Fair rejected the Pope's claims and even arranged for his capture in Anagni. The new Pope, Clement V, moved the papal residence from Rome to Avignon, beginning the so-called Avignon papal captivity. But Philip the Fair's most scandalous act was the destruction of the Knights Templar. On Friday, October 13, 1307, all Templars throughout France were simultaneously arrested. The monastic knights were accused of heresy, blasphemy, and debauchery. Under torture, they confessed to heinous crimes. The last Grand Master of the order, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake on the Ile de la Cité in 1314. The Templars' vast wealth added to the royal treasury. However, according to legend, before his death, Jacques de Molay cursed the royal line and called upon its representatives to appear with him before God's judgment within a year. Surprisingly, both Pope Clement V and King Philip the Fair himself died within a year of the Grand Master's execution. All three sons of Philip the Fair, Louis X the Quarrelsome, Philip V the Tall, and Charles IV the Handsome, died young without leaving male issue. In 1328, the direct Capetian line died after 3.5 centuries of rule. A dynastic crisis arose. Who should inherit the French throne? The closest male relatives were representatives of the Capetian collateral branches, the Counts of Valois and Évreux. But the English king, Edward III, also claimed his rights as Philip the Fair's maternal grandson. The French barons rejected the English king's claims, citing the principle that the land of lilies does not pass to women. The crown was inherited by Philip VI of the House of Valois, but the dynastic dispute became the pretext for the longest war of the Middle Ages. The Hundred Years' War began in 1337 and brought a series of catastrophic defeats to France. English longbowmen revolutionized military affairs. At Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356, the French knighthood was routed. King John II the Good himself was captured. France was forced to sign the humiliating Peace of Bretigny in 1360, under which the English received a third of French territory and a huge ransom for the king. The country was on the brink of collapse. The Dauphin Charles, the future King Charles V, barely held on to power, facing peasant and townspeople revolts. It seemed that France was doomed to disintegrate and disappear as an independent state. But the French demonstrated remarkable resilience and ingenuity. Constable Bertrand du Guesclin organized a guerrilla war against the English garrisons. Instead of chivalrous attacks, the French began to employ small-scale warfare tactics, ambushes, raids, and castle sieges. By the end of the reign of Charles V the Wise in 1380, the French had recaptured most of their lost territories. The English were left with only the port of Calais and a small area around Bordeaux. France had risen from the ashes of defeat. However, under Charles the Wise's son, King Charles VI, the country suffered a new catastrophe. The king suffered from bouts of madness, during which he completely lost his mind. Real power passed to his uncles and brothers, among whom a fierce struggle for influence began. The feud between the Armagnacs, supporters of the Duke of Orléans, and the Burgundians, adherents of the Duke of Burgundy, was particularly intense. France plunged into civil war. The young English king, Henry V, took advantage of this by landing in Normandy and renewing his ancestors' campaigns of conquest. On October 25, 1415 at Agincourt, the English army utterly routed a French force several times its size. The cream of the French nobility perished on the battlefield. The road to Paris was open. By 1419, the English and their Burgundian allies controlled all of northern France, including the capital. The Dauphin Charles was forced to flee south beyond the Loire. According to the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, after the death of the mad Charles VI, the French throne was to pass to the English King Henry VI, son of Henry V and daughter of Charles VI. France, as an independent state, was on the brink of extinction. In this darkest hour of French history, a miracle occurred. In 1429, a 17-year-old peasant girl from the village of Domremy in Lorraine arrived in Chinon to see the Dauphin Charles. Her name was Joan of Arc. She claimed to have received divine visions from the Archangel Michael, Saint Margaret, and Saint Catherine, who commanded her to expel the English from France and crown the Dauphin in Reims Cathedral. At first, the court treated the words of this simple girl with disbelief. But the desperate Dauphin decided to believe in a miracle. Joan was given a small force and armor, and she set off for the besieged Orléans, a key fortress on the Loire. The appearance of Joan of Arc had a stunning effect on the French troops and population. This simple peasant woman, who claimed to speak with angels, ignited the hearts of the French with faith in victory. On May 8, 1429, the siege of Orléans was lifted. The English retreated in panic, unable to comprehend what had happened. This victory was followed by further successes. Joan routed the English armies at Jargeau and Patay. The road to Reims was open. On July 17, 1429, in Reims Cathedral, Joan fulfilled her greatest mission. The Dauphin, Charles, was crowned King Charles VII. The Maid of Orléans became a symbol of French resistance and national rebirth. A tragic fate awaited the heroine of France. In 1430, while attempting to liberate Compiègne, Joan of Arc was captured by the Burgundians, who sold her to the English for 10,000 gold écus. The English understood that as long as the Maid of Orléans lived, the French would believe in miracles and continue their resistance. Joan was accused of witchcraft, heresy, and blasphemy. The Inquisition trial in Rouen lasted several months. The 19-year-old peasant stood courageously before learned theologians, defending the justice of her cause. On May 30, 1431, Joan of Arc was burned at the stake in the marketplace of Rouen as a heretic and witch. Her heroic deed became a legend that inspired the French struggle for independence. Joan of Arc's work was done. The French believed in victory and began a systematic offensive. Charles VII carried out military reforms, creating a standing royal army. Artillery began to play a decisive role in the sieges of English fortresses. One after another, the invaders' strongholds fell. In 1453, Bordeaux, the last English stronghold on the continent, capitulated. The 100 Years' War ended with complete French victory. The English retained only the port of Calais on French soil. National unity, forged in the crucible of war, became the foundation of the future greatness of the French state. Victory in the 100 Years' War came at a high price. The country lay in ruins, the population had fallen by a third, and the economy was in ruins. Many regions resembled deserts, villages burned, fields overgrown with weeds, roads swarming with bandits. Recovery took several decades. Louis I, nicknamed the Spider for his cunning and treachery, methodically subjugated rebellious feudal lords and annexed their lands to the royal domain. He defeated the powerful Duke of Burgundy, Charles the Bold, and annexed Burgundy. Provence and Anjou also became part of his domain. Under Louis XI's successors, Brittany and other regions were annexed to France. By the end of the 15th century, the country had become a unified, centralized state with a strong royal power. A strengthened France turned its gaze to Italy. In 1494, King Charles VIII invaded the Italian peninsula with a large army, claiming the Kingdom of Naples. The Italian Wars began, lasting over half a century and turning Italy into a battleground between France and the Habsburg Empire. These conflicts transformed European politics, transforming it into a struggle between great powers for hegemony. Francis I, a knight king and patron of the arts, fought the powerful Emperor Charles V for supremacy in Europe. At the Battle of Pavia in 1525, Francis was captured by the Spanish and imprisoned in Madrid. The Italian wars brought not only military glory, but also cultural achievements to France. Under Francis I, the French Renaissance began. The king invited Italian masters to the country, including the brilliant Leonardo da Vinci, who spent the last years of his life at the Château de Clous. Magnificent chateaux were built in the Loire Valley, Chambord, Blois, and Fontainebleau, which became masterpieces of Renaissance architecture. The French court became one of the most brilliant in Europe. The Pleiades poets, led by Pierre de Ronsard, created a new French poetry. Rabelais wrote his immortal Gargantua and Pantagruel. French culture experienced an unprecedented flowering. However, the religious upheavals of the 16th century did not bypass France. The ideas of the Protestant Reformation, preached by Martin Luther and John Calvin, resonated with some of the French nobility and townspeople. French Protestants were called Huguenots, a word possibly derived from the German Eingenossen, allies. The Huguenots demanded reform of the Catholic Church, French language services, and the right of the clergy to marry. The Catholic majority of the population and the clergy fiercely resisted heresy, seeing it as a threat to the traditional foundations of French society. Under the weak kings of the second half of the 16th century, religious tensions escalated into bloody civil wars. The country was torn apart by the Catholic League, led by the Dukes of Guise, and the Huguenot Party, led by the kings of Navarre. 8 religious wars brought untold disasters to France. The most horrific episode was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre on August 24, 1572, when thousands of Protestants were massacred in Paris and other cities. The bloody massacre lasted for several days and shocked all of Europe. France stood on the brink of collapse and anarchy. The savior of the fatherland was King Henry IV, the first representative of the Bourbon dynasty on the French throne. This outstanding ruler managed to reconcile the warring parties and restore the country's unity. Henry was born a Protestant, but for the sake of the crown, he converted to Catholicism, uttering the famous words, "Paris is worth a mass." His conversion was met with suspicion by both Catholics and Protestants, but the king proved the sincerity of his intentions. In 1598, he issued the Edict of Nantes, which granted the Huguenots freedom of religion and civil rights. The religious wars ended. Henry IV restored order and prosperity to the country, earning him the nickname the Good King. Henry IV's reign was cut short by the dagger of the Catholic fanatic François Ravaillac on May 14, 1610. The assassination of the popular king became a national tragedy. 9-year-old Louis XIII ascended the throne under the regency of his mother, Marie de' Medici. A time of palace intrigue and conspiracies began. The Queen Mother surrounded herself with Italian favorites, which displeased the French nobility. The young king remained in the shadows for a long time, but gradually began to assume power. The true ruler of France under Louis XIII was Cardinal Richelieu, appointed Prime Minister in 1624. Armand Jean Duplessis, Cardinal de Richelieu, proved to be one of the greatest statesmen in French history. He pursued a ruthless policy of strengthening royal power and French influence in Europe. Richelieu crushed the Huguenot political party, destroying their strongholds, including the rebellious La Rochelle, but preserved their religious freedom. He crushed the resistance of the high nobility by executing the Dukes of Montmorency and Biron. The system of intendants, royal officials, replaced the authority of local feudal lords. France became an absolute monarchy. In foreign policy, Richelieu made France the arbiter of European affairs. He entered the 30 Years' War on the side of the Protestant princes against the Catholic Habsburgs, guided not by religious but by state interests. French subsidies supported the Swedish king, Gustavus Adolphus, in his struggle against the emperor. Richelieu built a powerful navy and founded French colonies in America, New France in Canada, and islands in the Caribbean. Under his rule, the French Academy was established, dedicated to purifying and codifying the French language. The cardinal patronized the arts, and the great playwright Corneille worked at his court. After the deaths of Louis XIII and Richelieu in 1642 to 1643, the regency for the underage Louis XIV passed to the Queen Mother, Anne of Austria, and Cardinal Mazarin. Giulio Mazarin, Richelieu's student, continued his predecessor's policies, but his foreign origins and greed provoked discontent. In 1648, the Fronde Rebellion broke out, an attempt by the high nobility and the courts to limit absolute power. The Frondeurs demanded the convocation of the Estates General and the curtailment of royal prerogatives. The rebellion was suppressed, but it left a deep mark on the young king. Louis XIV never forgot the humiliations of his childhood when rebels broke into his bedroom. After Mazarin's death in 1661, he declared himself king. The era of absolute monarchy in its classic form began. Louis XIV, nicknamed the Sun King, concentrated all power in his own hands. He transformed the nobility into courtiers, depriving them of political influence but showering them with honors and pensions. The Palace of Versailles became a symbol of absolutism, a gigantic complex of buildings and parks where the king lived in strict ceremony, surrounded by thousands of courtiers. Versailles became a showcase of French culture and power. The court of Louis XIV saw the greatest masters of French art, the playwrights Molière, Racine, and Corneille, the composer Lully, the artists Lebrun and Mignard, the architect Mansart, and the gardener Lenôtre. French became the international language of diplomacy and culture. French fashion dictated its laws throughout Europe. Paris became the cultural capital of the world. But this splendor came at a cost. The upkeep of the court consumed enormous resources. Even more devastating were the constant wars of Louis XIV. The Sun King sought hegemony in Europe and the expansion of French borders to their natural limits, the Rhine, the Alps, and the Pyrenees. He waged war against Spain, Holland, the Empire, and England. The War of the Spanish Succession, which lasted from 1701 to 1714, nearly led to the collapse of France. A coalition of European powers, led by the brilliant military leader, the Duke of Marlborough, inflicted a series of crushing defeats on the French. Only diplomatic skill allowed France to avoid disaster. Louis XIV's grandson, Philip V, retained the Spanish throne, founding the Spanish Bourbon dynasty. The long 72-year reign of Louis XIV ended on September 1, 1715. The king outlived his son and grandson, and the crown passed to his great-grandson, 5-year-old Louis XV. A new regency was led by the Duke of Orleans, who attempted to moderate the absolutist regime. An attempt was made to restore the role of the nobility in government, but it failed. After Louis XV came of age, absolutism was restored, albeit in a less rigid form. Louis XV reigned for 59 years, but lacked the iron will of his predecessor. Policy was influenced by the king's mistresses, first Madame de Pompadour, then Madame du Barry. France participated in several European wars with varying success. The War of the Austrian Succession resulted in the annexation of Lorraine. But the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, ended in disaster. France suffered defeat at the hands of Prussia in Europe and at the hands of England in the colonies. Under the Treaty of Paris in 1763, the French lost almost all of their possessions in North America, Canada, Louisiana, and forts in India. The colonial empire, built over a century and a half, collapsed. The monarchy's authority was seriously undermined. The kingdom's financial situation was becoming increasingly precarious. Expenses for maintaining the court, army, and government apparatus grew faster than revenues. Attempts at reform were met with resistance. The suppression of the privileged classes, the nobility and clergy, who refused to pay taxes. Financial controllers Turgot, Necker, and Calonne failed one after another in their attempts to restore order to state finances. The budget deficit reached critical proportions. In 1774, the 20-year-old Louis XVI ascended the throne. The new king was a kind and educated man, but indecisive. He sincerely desired the welfare of his subjects, but lacked the strength of character necessary to implement reforms. Queen Marie Antoinette, daughter of the Austrian Empress, irritated the people with her extravagance and frivolous behavior. She was nicknamed Madame Deficit and blamed for all the country's ills. France's participation in the American War of Independence against England brought moral satisfaction from revenge for its defeat in the 7 Years' War, but it devastated its finances. By the end of the 1780s, the national debt stood at 4 billion livres, an astronomical sum at the time. Interest on the debt consumed half of all treasury revenue. Bankruptcy became inevitable. Under these circumstances, the king was forced to agree to convene the Estates General, a representative assembly of the estates that had not been convened since 1614. The elections to the Estates General stirred up the entire country. The Third Estate, representing the overwhelming majority of the population, demanded radical reforms. The voters' mandates included demands for limitations on royal power, the abolition of feudal privileges, and freedom of the press and trade. On May 5, 1789, the Estates General ceremoniously opened in Versailles. But from the very first days of its work, sharp contradictions arose. The clergy and nobility insisted on separate votes by estate, which would give them an advantage. The Third Estate demanded a general vote, which would give it a majority. The king hesitating to support one side or the other. On June 17th, the deputies of the Third Estate proclaimed themselves the National Assembly, declaring that they alone represented the nation. On June 20th, finding the assembly hall closed, the deputies gathered in the tennis court and swore the famous oath not to disperse until a constitution was adopted. They were joined by some of the clergy, led by Abbé Sieyès, and liberal nobles, led by the Marquis de Lafayette. The revolution had begun. On July 14, 1789, agitated Parisians stormed the Bastille fortress, the symbol of royal despotism. The old fortress held only 7 prisoners, but its fall had enormous symbolic significance. Peasant uprisings broke out across the country. The great fear engulfed villages. Peasants burned castles and destroyed feudal charters. The old order crumbled before their eyes. On August 4th, in a night session, the National Assembly abolished feudal dues and privileges. On August 26th, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was adopted, proclaiming the equality of all men before the law and the inalienable rights to liberty, property, and security. These principles shook the foundations of European society and became the standard for revolutions around the world. The revolution developed rapidly, becoming more radical with each passing month. The king lost all real power and was forced to agree to a constitution that limited his prerogative. National assets, the lands of the church and those of émigrés, were confiscated and sold. In 1791, the civil constitution of the clergy was adopted, subordinating the church to the state. Priests were required to swear an oath of allegiance to the nation. European monarchs watched the events in France with horror. Austria and Prussia formed an alliance to fight the revolution. In response, the Legislative Assembly declared war on the Austrian Emperor on April 20th, 1792. The era of revolutionary wars began, which would last for over 20 years and change the face of Europe. The war initially went poorly for the French. Prussian and Austrian troops invaded France. The Duke of Brunswick threatened to destroy Paris if the royal family was harmed. This ultimatum infuriated the Parisians. On August 10, 1792, a crowd stormed the Tuileries Palace. The royal guard was slaughtered, and the king and his family were imprisoned in the Temple Tower. The monarchy had fallen. On September 21, 1792, a new National Assembly, elected by universal suffrage, proclaimed a republic. King Louis was put on trial as a traitor to the nation. After heated debates, the convention unanimously sentenced him to death. On January 21st, 1793, the last king of Old France ascended the scaffold. His execution shocked Europe and made war on the revolution inevitable. The most radical revolutionaries, the Jacobins, led by Maximilien Robespierre, gradually came to power in France. The Incorruptible, as Robespierre was known, proclaimed a policy of terror against the enemies of the revolution. The Revolutionary Tribunal handed down death sentences by the dozens a day. The guillotine worked without ceasing. During the year of the Jacobin dictatorship, approximately 17,000 people were executed, including Queen Marie Antoinette, Girondin leaders, and former revolutionaries like Danton. The terror devoured its own children. On the 9th of Thermidor, year 2 of the Republic, July 27, 1794, the convention overthrew Robespierre. The Incorruptible and his supporters themselves ascended the scaffold. The Thermidorian coup ended the terror, but the revolution continued. Moderate Republicans came to power and established the Directory. The new government proved weak and corrupt. The Directory vacillated between the threat of Jacobin revanche on the left and a royalist restoration on the right. Military successes became the only source of prestige for the regime. Under these circumstances, the young General Napoleon Bonaparte, who had won brilliant victories in Italy, gained particular popularity. Napoleon was born in Corsica to a minor noble family in 1769. He received a military education and quickly rose to prominence thanks to his abilities in the revolutionary circumstances. The Italian campaign of 1796 to 1797 brought him European glory. The Egyptian campaign, though unsuccessful, cast a romantic aura around his name. On the 18th Brumaire of the year 8 of the Republic, November 9th, 1799, Napoleon, with the support of some of the directors, staged a coup d'état. The Directory was overthrown, and a consular regime was established, headed by 3 consuls. Napoleon became first consul, and he gradually concentrated all power in his hands. Napoleon proved himself not only a great military leader, but also an outstanding statesman. He carried out important domestic reforms that outlived him. The Civil Code, the Napoleonic Code, became a model for the legislation of many countries. The Concordat with the Pope reconciled France with the Catholic Church. A streamlined administrative system was created, with prefects heading departments. The Legion of Honor was established to reward meritorious service to the fatherland. However, Napoleon's primary passion remained war and power. In 1804, he proclaimed himself Emperor of the French. Pope Pius VII arrived in Paris for the coronation, but at the decisive moment, Napoleon crowned himself, demonstrating that his authority emanated not from God, but from his own will. The era of the First Empire had begun. The French army under Napoleon seemed invincible. The emperor routed the Austrians and Russians at Austerlitz in 1805, the Battle of the Three Emperors. The Prussians were utterly defeated at Jena and Auerstedt in 1806. The Russians were defeated at Friedland in 1807. The Treaty of Tilsit with the Russian Emperor Alexander I was the first to divide Europe into spheres of influence. By 1812, the French Empire had reached unprecedented proportions. 130 departments from Hamburg to Rome were under the direct control of Paris. Vassal kingdoms were ruled by relatives of the emperor. Jerome ruled Westphalia, Joseph ruled Spain, Louis ruled Holland, and Murat ruled Naples. The continental blockade was intended to stifle the trade of England, Napoleon's last enemy. But the empire was built on sand. The conquered peoples resented French domination. Particularly fierce resistance developed in Spain, where guerrilla warfare was depleting French forces. Russia's violation of the continental blockade led to a break with Alexander I. Napoleon made the fateful decision to march on Russia. On June 24, 1812, the Grande Armée, 600,000 strong, crossed the Neman. It was the largest army in human history up to that time. But the Russian campaign turned disastrous. The Russians avoided a decisive battle, luring the French deeper into the country. The Battle of Borodino on September 7th failed to bring Napoleon a decisive victory. The entry into Moscow turned into a trap. The city was engulfed in flames. The retreat from Russia turned into a disaster. Early winter, Cossack and partisan attacks, hunger and disease decimated the Grande Armée. Of 600,000 men, only about 30,000 managed to cross the border. The European powers formed a new coalition against a weakened France. The 1813 campaign in Germany and the Allied invasion of France in 1814 ended in the collapse of the empire. On March 30th, 1814, Russian, Austrian, and Prussian troops entered Paris. Napoleon abdicated and was exiled to the island of Elba in the Mediterranean. The Bourbons returned to the French throne in the person of Louis XVIII, the brother of the executed king. The Restoration had begun. The new king, wise from his experience in exile, understood the need for compromise with the new France. The Constitutional Charter of 1814 preserved the main gains of the Revolution, but restored the monarchy. France gained a constitutional system with a bicameral parliament. However, the return of the old dynasty did not mean the end of the Napoleonic era. On March 1st, 1815, the emperor landed at Bayonne near Caen and marched on Paris. The troops sent to arrest him defected to his side. Louis XVIII fled, and the reign of the 100 Days began. The European powers declared Napoleon an outlaw and assembled a new coalition. The campaign in Belgium was to decide the emperor's fate. On June 18th, 1815, at Waterloo, the French army suffered final defeat at the hands of the Anglo-Prussian forces under the command of the Duke of Wellington and Field Marshal Blücher. Napoleon abdicated for a second time and was exiled to the island of St. Helena in the Atlantic Ocean, where he died in 1821. The Second Bourbon Restoration proved longer, but no less controversial. After the death of Louis XVIII in 1824, the throne passed to his brother, Charles X, who dreamed of a return to the old order. The ordinances of July 25, 1830, restricting freedom of the press and voting rights, sparked an outcry in Paris. The glorious 3 days of the Revolution, from July 27th to 29th, 1830, overthrew Charles X. Liberal politicians, led by Thiers, enthroned the Duke of Orléans, who took the name Louis-Philippe I and the title King of the French. The July monarchy, a compromise between legitimists and republicans, had begun. Louis-Philippe, the bourgeois king, reigned for 18 years, relying on the wealthy bourgeoisie. It was a time of industrial revolution and economic development. Railroads were built, manufacturing flourished, and banks prospered. France expanded its colonial holdings, conquering Algeria and beginning to penetrate West Africa and Indochina. Paris was adorned with new monuments, including the Arc de Triomphe. However, Louis-Philippe's regime was gradually losing popularity. Suffrage was limited by a high property qualification. Less than 200,000 people could vote. The working class and petty bourgeoisie were excluded from politics. Corruption flourished and social problems grew. The opposition demanded expanded voting rights and democratic reforms. The economic crisis of 1847 and a poor harvest exacerbated social tensions. The opposition's banquet campaign culminated in a revolutionary explosion. On February 24, 1848, Louis-Philippe abdicated. The Second Republic was proclaimed, introducing universal male suffrage. The provisional government included both moderate Republicans, led by Lamartine, and socialists like Louis Blanc. Freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and universal suffrage were proclaimed. The workday was limited to 10 hours in Paris and 11 in the provinces. National workshops were created to combat unemployment. However, sharp contradictions soon emerged between the various Republican factions. The conservative peasantry and the bourgeoisie became fearful of socialist experiments. Moderate Republicans won the elections to the Constituent Assembly. The closure of the national workshops in June sparked an uprising of Parisian workers, which was brutally suppressed by General Cavaignac. The presidential elections yielded an unexpected result. Napoleon's nephew, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, won the election, receiving over 5 million votes to Cavaignac's 1.5 million. The allure of Napoleon's name and promises of order and glory ensured success for a candidate who had previously been little known in France. The new president proved a more ambitious and skillful politician than his opponents had imagined. The Constitution prohibited re-election to a second term, but Louis Napoleon had no intention of leaving the political scene. On December 2, 1851, the anniversary of Napoleon's coronation and the Battle of Austerlitz, he staged a coup d'etat. The assembly was dissolved and opposition leaders were arrested. The plebiscite approved the coup by 7 million votes to 600,000. Louis Napoleon assumed dictatorial power for 10 years. A year later, on December 2, 1852, he proclaimed himself emperor, taking the name Napoleon III. The Second Empire lasted 18 years and became a time of monumental transformation. Napoleon III and his prefect of the Seine, Baron Haussmann, radically rebuilt Paris. Narrow medieval streets were demolished, replaced by wide boulevards. Train stations, theaters, and shops were built. Paris became a modern capital with gas lighting, sewerage, and running water. At the same time, industry developed. Railroads, factories, and banks were built. France experienced an economic boom. In foreign policy, the emperor sought to restore French hegemony in Europe. The Crimean War against Russia, 1854 to 1856, ended successfully. The Congress of Paris in 1856 confirmed France's return to the ranks of the great powers. Participation in the unification of Italy brought France Savoy and Nice. Colonial expeditions to Indochina, Mexico, and Africa expanded the empire. However, the empire's prestige was undermined by the failed Mexican adventure. The attempt to place the Austrian Archduke Maximilian on the Mexican throne ended in disaster. Under pressure from the United States, French troops withdrew from Mexico, and Maximilian was executed by Republicans. At the same time, Prussia, under Chancellor Bismarck, grew stronger, challenging French hegemony. Napoleon III's fatal mistake, declaring war on Prussia in July 1870, turned into a national disaster. The superbly trained Prussian army under Moltke routed the French in border battles. On September 2nd at Sedan, the emperor was captured along with Marshal MacMahon's 100,000-strong army. News of the emperor's capture sparked a revolution in Paris. On September 4, 1870, a crowd stormed the Legislative Assembly building and proclaimed a republic. The government of national defense, led by Gambetta, attempted to continue the war, but the odds were unequal. Paris was besieged by Prussian troops. Famine and cold forced the capital to capitulate on January 28, 1871. The preliminary peace at Versailles cost France Alsace, part of Lorraine, and a 5 billion franc indemnity. But the national humiliation was not over. In the Hall of Mirrors of the Palace of Versailles, a symbol of French grandeur, on January 18, 1871, the German Empire was proclaimed, with the Prussian king at its head. The defeat was not only military, but also moral. The humiliating peace sparked outrage in Paris. On March 18, 1871, an uprising broke out, bringing the Paris Commune to power. The Thiers government took refuge in Versailles and began a siege of its own capital. The bloody week of May 21st to 28th culminated in the government troops storming Paris. Around 20,000 communards were killed or executed. Civil war completed the national catastrophe. On the ruins of the Second Empire, the Third Republic arose, lasting until 1940. The Republic's early years were a time of severe trials, occupation, indemnities, political instability. The monarchists held a majority in the National Assembly and were preparing for a restoration. Only disagreement between the Legitimists and the Orleanists saved the Republic. Gradually, Republican institutions were strengthened. The constitutional laws of 1875 established a parliamentary system with a president elected by Congress and a bicameral parliament. Jules Ferry implemented important educational reforms. Primary school became free, compulsory, and secular. Democratic freedoms were gradually expanded. France recovered from the defeat with remarkable speed. The indemnity was paid ahead of schedule, and the territory was liberated from occupation. The creation of a second colonial empire, the world's most extensive after Britain's, began. French possessions stretched from Algeria and Morocco in North Africa to Indochina in Asia, from Madagascar to the islands of Oceania. At the end of the 19th century, France experienced a cultural flowering. Paris was recognized as the capital of the arts. The Impressionists flourished here, and the best writers and sculptors worked there. World's fairs showcased technological advances. The Eiffel Tower, a symbol of modern France, was built. French civilization influenced the entire world. However, the international situation worsened. Bismarck's alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy isolated France. In response, French diplomacy concluded an alliance with Russia in 1894, followed by an entente cordiale with England in 1904. Europe was split into two hostile camps. The shot fired in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, ignited Europe's powder keg. For France, World War I began with the German invasion of Belgium and the advance on Paris. The Schlieffen Plan envisioned the swift defeat of France before Russia could mobilize its armies. The Battle of the Marne, from September 6th to 12th, 1914, saved Paris and changed the nature of the war. The German advance was halted and trench warfare began. The front stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border. For 4 years, the opponents annihilated each other in a senseless massacre. Verdun, the Somme, the Road to Glory. These names became symbols of senseless carnage. Over the course of 4 years of war, France lost over 1.3 million men, almost 10% of its male population. An entire generation was wiped out by the war. Industrial areas in the north and east lay in ruins. Victory in the war came at a high price. France regained Alsace-Lorraine, received a mandate to govern Syria and Lebanon, and acquired some of Germany's African colonies. But the country was exhausted and weakened. A demographic crisis, destruction, and debt. All of this impacted the country's development during the interwar period. The 1920s brought relative stability. Raymond Poincaré implemented a financial reform that stabilized the franc. Industry recovered and living standards rose. France participated in the creation of a collective security system, the League of Nations and the Locarno Accords. Aristide Briand's policy of reconciliation with Germany raised hopes for a lasting peace. The global economic crisis of 1929 hit France somewhat late, but very painfully. Industrial production fell, unemployment rose, and social tensions intensified. Extreme forces, communists and fascists, rose to prominence on the political scene. The February events of 1934 nearly led to civil war. The threat of fascism forced left-wing forces to unite. In 1936, a popular front government led by socialist Léon Blum came to power. Important social reforms were implemented, including a 40-hour work week, paid vacations, and collective bargaining agreements. But economic hardship and international tensions undermined the left bloc's position. Hitler's rise to power in Germany in 1933 revived the German threat. France attempted to create a system of containment by forming alliances with Eastern European countries. But Britain's policy of appeasement and the isolationism of the United States weakened the anti-German coalition. The Munich Agreement of 1938, which ceded the Sudetenland to Hitler, became the prelude to a new war. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. France and England declared war on Hitler but took no active military action. The phony war began, 8 months of inactivity on the Western Front. The French hid behind the Maginot Line and awaited the German offensive. The blow came on May 10, 1940. German tank divisions broke through the Ardennes and outflanked the Maginot Line. The French army, considered the strongest in Europe, collapsed within 6 weeks. Marshal Pétain's government signed an armistice on June 22 in the same train car in Compiègne Forest, where Germany capitulated in 1918. France was divided into 2 zones, the German-occupied zone and the formerly independent state of Vichy, led by Marshal Pétain. The Vichy regime pursued a policy of collaboration with Germany and anti-Semitism. The National Revolution proclaimed the slogan, "Work, Family, Fatherland," instead of the Republican "Liberty, Equality, Fraternity." But France did not accept defeat. On June 18, 1940, Brigadier General Charles de Gaulle broadcast a call for resistance from London. "France lost the battle, but not the war," declared the future president. A resistance movement was born, involving communists, Gaullists, socialists, and other patriotic forces. The resistance took various forms, from sabotage and reconnaissance to armed struggle in the mountains and forests. The Maquis, or partisan units, were particularly active in remote areas. Jean Moulin united various resistance groups under the auspices of de Gaulle. The French fought not only in France, but also as part of the Allied forces in Africa, Italy, and the Pacific. The Allied landing in Normandy on June 6, 1944, began the liberation of France. A second landing in Provence on August 15th hastened the collapse of the German defense. Paris was liberated on August 25th. General de Gaulle entered the capital as head of the provisional government of the French Republic. France was restored to its 1939 borders and granted the status of a victorious power. The French occupation zone in Germany and a seat on the UN Security Council confirmed the country's return to the ranks of great powers. But the price of victory was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of casualties, a devastated economy, and a divided society. After the war, the question of France's political structure arose. A referendum rejected the restoration of the Third Republic, and work began on a new constitution. The Fourth Republic was established with a strong parliament and a weak president. Women were given the right to vote, and a social security system was created. However, the new regime was marked by political instability from the very beginning. 24 governments changed over the course of 12 years. France participated in the creation of NATO and the beginnings of European integration, but its position in the world was weakening. Decolonization brought painful defeats, the loss of Indochina after the defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. The final crisis of the Fourth Republic stemmed from the Algerian War. The Algerian uprising, which began in 1954, divided French society. The mutiny of Algerian generals on May 13, 1958, brought the country to the brink of civil war. Parliament called on General de Gaulle to take power as the only person capable of resolving the crisis. De Gaulle agreed to lead the government on the condition that the Constitution be revised. The Constitution of the Fifth Republic was adopted, establishing a strong presidential power. De Gaulle became the first president of the new republic and held power for 10 years, from 1958 to 1969. De Gaulle's greatest achievement was the resolution of the Algerian problem. Contrary to expectations, he granted Algeria independence in 1962. This decision cost him popularity with some French citizens, but it allowed the country to focus on modernization. France became a nuclear power, withdrew from NATO, and pursued an independent foreign policy. The glorious 30 years of economic growth transformed France into a modern industrial power. New industries developed: nuclear energy, aircraft manufacturing, and electronics. New cities, highways, and airports were built. The standard of living for the French increased significantly. France became a leader in European integration. The events of May 1968, student unrest and a general strike, shaken de Gaulle's regime. Although order was restored, the president's authority was shaken. The failed referendum of 1969 forced the general to resign. France entered the post-Gaullist era. De Gaulle's successors, Georges Pompidou, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, François Mitterrand, and Jacques Chirac, continued the course of modernization and European integration. Under Mitterrand, important social reforms were implemented. The death penalty was abolished, the work week was shortened, and women's rights were expanded. France became a founding member of the Eurozone. In the 21st century, France faces new challenges. Immigration from Africa and the Middle East has changed the ethnic composition of the population. Terrorist attacks have shaken the country. Economic competition from developing countries has weakened its industry. European integration is causing controversy. Presidents Nicolas Sarkozy, François Hollande, and Emmanuel Macron are attempting to adapt the country to globalization while maintaining French identity. Reforms to the labor market, pension system, and public sector are sparking social protests. The Yellow Vest movement revealed the depth of social discontent. The history of France is a history of constantly searching for a balance between tradition and innovation, between national interests and European solidarity. From the Gallic tribes to the modern republic, the French people have traveled a long and glorious path. Ups and downs, triumphs and tragedies have forged the character of a nation that gave the world the ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity. This great history has created a great culture: the French language, literature, art, cuisine, and fashion. Today, France remains one of the cultural and political centers of the planet, a country that continues to influence the course of world history. Whatever trials await it in the future, the rich legacy of the past gives every reason to believe that the French nation will find worthy responses to the challenges of the times and maintain its place among the world's leading powers. Share in the comments which period of French history you found most fascinating. What struck you most about this journey through centuries of French history? Subscribe to the channel and like it so you don't miss new, fascinating stories about great countries and their amazing destinies.